So I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Mike Weber. Mike is a popular returning speaker for the museum, and he has a long history and love of Cornwall. As a child, he collected rock and mineral specimens from in and around the mine's waste rock piles, and that led him to the study of geology. As a 1982 geoscience graduate from Penn State University, Mike worked for 36 years as a geologist, health physicist, and manager for the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I almost messed that up. And the U.S. Geological Survey. After retiring from federal service, he, of course, returned to Cornwall, where he serves as a guide and researches the history of mining and geology of Cornwall and similar deposits in Pennsylvania. Mike is a weekly volunteer at the museum and gives guided tours of the Cornwall Iron Furnace on most Fridays. He is also the author of Always More Production. There's a copy of which sitting up here, which is a history of the mining operations at Cornwall that is now available for sale at the Cornwall Iron Furnace Museum store. So Friday through Sunday, come on over to the museum. We'd happy to sell you a copy. And if you happen to come on a lot of Fridays, but not coming up here because you're going to Cape Cod, you can even get one copy signed. So please welcome our speaker, Mike Weber.
I think Mike is as gleeful to say that the book is available as I am. I know that in the last year, as he's introduced me for these seminars, he's frequently made reference to that book. So those of you who are ardent proponents of these seminars, you've probably been wondering, when is the book going to be here? Well, it's finally here. And the benefits from the sale of that book go to support the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates. So please, if you're at all interested in the history of mining at Cornwall, it might be something that you would be interested in. So I want to welcome you this evening, and I especially want to welcome those of you who are joining us here at Cornwall Manor, as well as those who are joining via Zoom, both in the United States and abroad. Tonight's presentation, as Mike's already alluded to, is on the end of an era, the end of the 236 years that iron ore was mined here in Cornwall. And it's actually part of a series of talks and presentations which lead up to the commemoration, the 50-year commemoration of the end of mining here at Cornwall. Mining ended in 1973. So this month, June 30, will be the last day 50 years ago that mining occurred at Cornwall. I'd like to thank the friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace for sponsoring this webinar, to Cornwall Manor for hosting us here at Freeman Hall. And in particular, I'd like to thank Mike Emery, who just introduced me as the site administrator from Cornwall, Kathy Donaldson, who's the treasurer from the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates, and Bruce Chadbourne, who is a researcher, a videographer, a guide, and resident of Cornwall Manor. And on Saturday, you're going to be giving a bit of an invocation, right? In honor and tribute to the miners and the millers. So with that, let's see. Oh, get rid of this. There. All these things pop up. That's another one of those unique features of Zoom. After the brief interview that I'm about to give you, I plan to take you on a tour of Cornwall as we reflect on the legacy of 2 centuries of iron mining right here in Cornwall. My presentation tonight will take a retrospective look at mining at Cornwall. So instead of proceeding chronologically, this happened in 1737, this happened in 1739, I'm going to be starting with the present and looking back on that 200 years of mining. And that includes the lay of the land today in and around Cornwall, the total amounts of ore that were produced over the 236 years, the surrounding industry that was spawned by the rich and abundant iron ore from Cornwall, and of course, the miners and millers. Although I will mostly focus on mining in Cornwall, I will talk about the operations of the concentrator plants, both in Lebanon and here in Cornwall, as well as some of the local furnaces that use the iron ore from Cornwall to produce iron over the years. And of course, as in prior presentations, I'll leave plenty of time at the end of my presentation to answer your questions and listen to any comments that you may have. In 1857, the editor of the Press in Philadelphia, which was a popular periodical publication at the time, called the mines at Cornwall the principal attraction of the Lebanon Valley, and truly a mineral and geological curiosity, well worth the ride from Philadelphia to behold. Now you think about that, that was 1857. Driving up here in a wagon or riding a horse from Philadelphia would have been quite a commitment for somebody to make in order to view this curiosity. When we visit Cornwall today, of course, the most evident landmark of the mining is the large open pit. And that open pit was mined from the mid-1700s until mining came to a conclusion in June of 1973. The pit today is up to 450 feet deep, and about 300 feet of water is lying in that pit. So it's important to recognize that today, most of the open pit is no longer visible from the surface. Of course, the mines looked a lot different when they were operating, as seen in this photo from August of 1969. So from the front of the photo to the back, you see the number 3 mine there in the lower left-hand corner. That's in the foreground and in the western end of the open pit. And then behind it, you see the open pit. And then you see that circular cut in the open pit. That's where the east end ore body was mined, quite close to Miners Village. And then Big Hill lies on the other side of Boyd Street. And then, of course, behind Big Hill, you have the number 4 mine and the concentrator plant. I refer to the Cornwall Mines in plural because the miners produced iron ore from multiple mines. So it's appropriate to talk about the mines of Cornwall. Now, another way to portray the mines is on a standard topographical quadrangle map, which you can see here. The large body of water represented in the light blue in the middle of the map is the lake that resides today in the open pit. I marked the location of the number 3 shaft, again, in the western end of the open pit. And that descended down into the underground mine that was constructed below the floor of the pit. I highlighted in the darker blue dashed line the approximate extent of the underground excavations for the number 3 mine. And then you can see the hills from left to right or from west to east, Grassy Hill, Middle Hill, and then Big Hill. The crater that was excavated in Big Hill was later backfilled with waste rock from the mining operation. And the number 4 mine is then located about a half mile east of the open pit, off to the right there. And there you can see the number 4 and the number 5 shafts. And that's also close to the concentrator plant. Again, the darker blue line that's dashed reflects the approximate extent of the underground excavations for the number 4 mine off to the right. And that mine excavated ore that was from 150 feet deep down to 1,225 feet. And then near the concentrator plant is the Elizabeth mine, or the Elizabeth opening. Now let's look at each of those mines in a bit more detail. So the most prominent of the mines, as I've already alluded to, is the open pit, and that was a surface mine. This aerial photograph was taken in April 1974. And that was almost a year after the mines closed in June 73. The closest community to the open pit is Miners Village, which you can see just south of the rim of the open pit. By 1974, water had indeed begun accumulating in the western end of the pit, close to the bottom of the photo. And the southeastern end of the pit, closer to Miners Village. I don't want to press too hard or it'll give me too many clicks. Before the photo was taken, Bethlehem Steel had completed the decommissioning of the open pit, and that included removing storage containers, buildings, and water and electrical supply lines, among other things. The miners excavated ore when they were mining the open pit that existed as a tilted layer that extended from the upper left-hand side, the tops of Grassy Hill and Middle Hill, down to the right in the bottom of the pit. And that layer was a couple hundred feet thick. And so you can see on the left, the diabase or trap rock footwall, that was the rock that was beneath the iron ore. So you would not have seen that before the miners had excavated the iron ore. And then the bowl-shaped excavation in the southeastern end of the pit is the east end ore body. And that signifies the last location where ore was mined in the pit in June 1973. Now, before mining began in the open pit, the first ore was mined in Big Hill. And that's when Peter Grubb removed the iron ore in 1737 in order to demonstrate the suitability of that ore for use in the furnace that he was to build from 1739 until 1742. That's the Cornwall Iron Furnace. As the miners excavated the ore, they dug the ore out from the crest of the hill and created a large crater. And you can see that crater in the upper left-hand photo. That is a railroad train going across the crest there. That crater was several hundred feet deep by the time they had removed the ore, and the picture is taken in 1894. Miners were aided in removing that ore by the use of a spiral railroad that was designed by W. Lawrence. And at the time, that was in the fall of 1864, at that time, that was considered an engineering marvel because you didn't have too many of those spiral railroads around the world. In the 1900s, then miners started backfilling that large crater with waste rock from the mining operation. And a lot of that waste rock came from the number 4 mine, which was developed later. The middle photo shows the backfilling in progress from the 1940s, and behind that mound of crushed rock is Miners Village, and then to the right of that mound would be the large open pit. Today, Big Hill remains a big hill thanks to the millions of tons of waste rock that went in and filled that crater. Between the outcrops of diabase or trap rock, both north and south of Big Hill. When the grandson of Peter Grubb sold his portion of the mine to Robert Coleman in 1786, he reserved the right to mine sufficient ore to supply to one furnace. That right was eventually sold to the Robesonia Iron Company. The Robesonia Iron Company mined that iron ore to feed its furnace in nearby Robesonia, and that mine was in the eastern end of the open pit, close to Furnace Creek between Big Hill and Middle Hill, and they mined that until 1927. This part of the pit was therefore referred to as the Robesonia Cut, which you can see in this photo taken in the early 1900s. Now, although the Robesonia miners were removing ore from the same ore deposit that was being mined in the open pit, those operations were being conducted entirely independently of the mining that was being conducted by the Colemans, the Coleman-heirs, the Grubbs, and later by the Cornwall Ore Bank Company. After Bethlehem Steel acquired the Robesonia company, mining in the Robesonia cut was then integrated with mining at Big Hill and the rest of the open pit. So Bethlehem Steel took over mining at Cornwall when they acquired a majority of the shares in the Cornwall Ore Bank Company in 1916. And at that time, they encouraged miners to boost production of the iron ore. One of the ways that they decided to boost the production was to excavate iron ore from below the floor of the pit using a deep mine or an underground mine called the Number 3 mine. In 1921, the Cornwall division of Bethlehem Steel started excavating that mine, and the first ore was shipped from that mine, the Number 3 mine, in April of 1925. Operations in the mine were suspended both during the Great Depression because of the lack of a demand for iron ore, and again from 1941 until 1953 to avoid interrupting or disrupting the mining that was going on overhead in the open pit. Mining continued in the Number 3 mine until it closed in June 1972 due to flooding associated with Tropical Storm Agnes. The photo on the left of this slide shows the buildings at the surface of the Number 3 mine that remained briefly after the closure of the mine. At the bottom, on the right, you can see the Number 3 shaft or slope, as it was sometimes called, as it looked in 2021. At the bottom of the incline, if you look down there, down that slope, you can see water that's accumulated at the entrance to the shaft for the Number 3 mine. And of course, in the background, you see the lake in the open pit. Like the Number 3 mine, the Number 4 mine was also an underground mine at Cornwall that excavated iron ore from below the surface of the ground. The Number 4 mine mined the eastern ore body, which was discovered in 1919, about a half-mile east of the open pit. Construction of the Number 4 mine began in 1924, and the first ore was shipped from the Number 4 mine in July of 1927. The photo on the left shows the head frames, those towers, both at the top of the Number 4 and the Number 5 shafts, which are highlighted there, as well as the concentrator plant in the valley below the shafts, and the conveyor, that straight line going up the top of the photo, that transported ore to the concentrator plant from the Number 3 mine, and that was located about a mile to the west of the Number 4 mine. The Number 4 shaft of the Number 4 mine hauled most of the ore out of the mine, whereas the Number 5 shaft was principally used to transport the miners, the equipment that was used underground, and the materials that were being used in the mining operation. So the photo on the right shows the steel marker in the concrete seal of the Number 5 shaft of the Number 4 mine, and that includes the day that the mine flooded, June 22nd, 1972, as well as the date that the mine was sealed about a year later on September 13th, 1973. During the 18th century, another one of the mines, the miners excavated iron ore from what was then called the Elizabeth Opening. It was a small pit just to the east of Big Hill, and it was located just outside the original survey line that designated the extent of the ore deposit. The mine supplied ore to the Elizabeth Furnace that was located about 7 miles to the east down in Brickerville. Mining in the Elizabeth mine ended soon after it began, likely when Robert Coleman acquired most of the Cornwall ore deposit in 1798. Since he was running the Elizabeth Furnace, now he had the Cornwall ore, he no longer needed to mine the Elizabeth Opening. And then almost 160 years later, Bethlehem Steel reactivated mining in the Elizabeth mine as a surface mine to supplement ore production from Cornwall in 1960 and 1961. The Cornwall division constructed a temporary rock crusher to break the ore down into smaller pieces, and then they loaded that crushed ore into railroad cars and transported that ore to the concentrator plant in Lebanon. After most of the ore was removed from the Elizabeth mine, the company used part of the area to construct a 200-foot diameter thickener tank for the new concentrator plant, which was then located at Cornwall. So speaking of concentrator plants, in the early 20th century, Pennsylvania Steel Company and the Cornwall Ore Bank Company decided that Cornwall ore needed to be processed to boost its iron concentration to remain competitive. Consequently, they built the concentrator plant, or otherwise known as the Concy to the locals, near Lehman and 16th Streets in Lebanon in 1904 and 1905. The photo on this slide is taken in the mid-1940s. Between 1905 and 1962, most of the ore that was mined at Cornwall was processed through this concentrator plant. The plant crushed the iron ore to a fine powder, then separated the iron using magnets, and then processed both physically and chemically the remaining solution in what was called the flotation plant. The flotation plant was used to recover both a copper concentrate and a pyrite concentrate. And most of the iron that was extracted from the ore at the Lebanon concentrator was produced as sintered iron until 1950. And after 1950, the iron concentrate was produced both as iron sinter and as those little iron pellets that you sometimes find along the rail trail right here in Cornwall. The copper and pyrite concentrates were then processed off-site to recover copper, silver, gold, and cobalt, as well as iron and sulfur. And in 1962, the concentrator operations moved to Cornwall, and so the Lebanon concentrator plant closed, and most of the buildings at the concentrator plant were then subsequently demolished. So you might imagine a plant like that processing a large amount of ore will generate a large amount of waste. Where did that go? Well, after 1935, the liquid wastes remaining, including the solids that they contained from the ore processing at the concentrator plant, were pumped to a large tailings impoundment near the intersection of Route 72 and Sand Hill Road. So this impoundment was located just west of the Sand Hill area, west of Lebanon. Local residents referred to the tailings as schmutz, based on the German word for dirt or dirty. The photo shows the tailings impoundment with the city of Lebanon seen in the background. The solids in the tailings accumulated in that shallow lake or impoundment, whereas the liquids either slowly evaporated or trickled into the shallow groundwater underneath the impoundment. And when the tailings were no longer being actively deposited, Bethlehem Steel covered the tailings with soil and planted grasses and other vegetation to stabilize the tailings. Now, with about 10 years worth of ore remaining at Cornwall, Bethlehem Steel constructed a new concentrator plant at Cornwall that used the technology which had been developed and refined based on what had been used at the Lebanon concentrator plant for the previous 50 years. The new concentrator plant began operating in Cornwall in April of 1962 and closed shortly after mining ended in June of 73. And then the concentrator in Cornwall resumed operations for a couple years, 1975 to 1977, to process iron ores which had been imported from overseas. And then it closed permanently. The tall building that you can see in this photo on the left side is where the pellet furnaces were housed. Those furnaces baked the little iron pellets. They didn't melt the iron, but it baked it into a nice solid pellet form. And then the building on the right, the lower building, is the mill building. That's where the ore was crushed, and then magnets were used to separate the iron from the other materials in the iron ore. That lower building also housed the flotation plant. And again, that's where they processed and produced the copper concentrate and the pyrite concentrate. And there's that circular pond in the foreground, the 200-foot diameter thickener tank, and that was operated as part of the flotation plant. You can see the colors of the number 4 and the number 5 shafts, which I've highlighted there with the arrows, but you no longer see the head frames because by the time this photo was taken, the mines were closed, and so the head frames had been removed. Over the decades since the plant closed, it's been used for a variety of purposes. And today, if you were to go there, all you would see are old concrete foundations, which are the primary remnants of the concentrator plant. Now, just like in Lebanon, you had to have a place to deposit the waste products from the concentrator plant. So the solid and liquid wastes from the Cornwall concentrator were discharged into a large impoundment above Rexmont. You can see the large embankment that was used to trap the tailings from Route 419 just east of Cornwall. The photo in this slide was taken in 1977, about the time that the concentrator plant permanently closed after processing those foreign ores. After most of the water evaporated from the tailings, just like before, Bethlehem Steel covered the tailings with soil and planted grasses and other vegetation to stabilize the tailings. Today, the so-called Tailings 9 holes of the Iron Valley Golf Club are located on top of the tailings impoundment. And you can see the Tailings 9 in that aerial photograph in the lower right of this slide. I flipped it upside down, so it's about the same orientation that the original tailings impoundment is. So now let's talk about the total ore produced from Cornwall. Over the 236 years of mining at Cornwall, the mines produced about 106 million tons of iron ore, and that's captured in this chart. By far, most of the ore was produced during the last 50 years that the mines operated under the leadership of Bethlehem Steel. For the first 110 years, that real flat line to the left, the amount of ore mined at this scale can barely be seen above the horizon. Then after about 1849, the production amount slowly increased as the demand for iron ore increased from Cornwall, mining became more coordinated, and new technologies were used to extract and transport the iron ore. You can then see marked improvements in the production amounts from 1864 till 1917, when the mines were being operated by the Cornwall Ore Bank Company. After the Great Depression, the Cornwall mines routinely produced more than 1 million tons of ore every year, until production fell shortly before the mines closed in 1973. In the next 2 slides, we'll examine in greater detail production of iron ore by the Cornwall Ore Bank Company and by the Bethlehem Steel Corporation. Production rates of iron ore from the Cornwall mines began to grow significantly under the leadership of the Cornwall Ore Bank Company, and that company was established in 1864. In the 1880s, production rates were boosted through the use of railroads to haul the ore and the use of steam and pneumatic drills to drill into and blast the ore and the waste rock. Most of the ore was sold to large hot blast furnaces at that time. However, the production rates began to level off again as a result of competition with other iron ore sources, including the Mesabi Range and the Great Lakes ores, as well as the reduced attractiveness of the Cornwall ores and various economic downturns, which caused some ups and downs in those production amounts. The production rates climbed again after the turn of the 20th century, when the Cornwall mines produced in excess of 1 million tons of ore in a single year in 1905 for the first time. And the company used more advanced technologies to extract the ore, such as steam shovels, crushers, and skip hoists, as well as operated the concentrator plant in Lebanon. Moving to the Bethlehem Steel years, you can see in this graph how iron ore production rates continued to increase until they peaked during the World War II years. Bethlehem Steel accomplished these increases by investing in improved equipment, by better stripping of the waste rock in the open pit, synchronizing operations between the mine and the concentrator plants, and developing and operating those two underground mines, the number 3 and the number 4 mines, in addition to the open pit. The company also used data analysis to trim unnecessary expenses and to boost employee efficiency. After production from the open pit paused in 1953, Bethlehem Steel found it difficult, however, to continue to maintain those increased production rates from the underground mines alone, the number 3 and the number 4 mine. Production was also hampered by lower ore grades, greater haulage distances, dilution of the ore with waste rock, water intrusion, and equipment breakdowns. In 1972, the boom lowered. Tropical Storm Agnes disrupted production of power nearby Lebanon, which caused the flooding of the underground mines and the open pit. In July of 1972, Bethlehem Steel decided to not resume mining in the underground mines because of the small reserves of iron ore that remained in those underground mines and the large expenses that would have been associated with rebuilding the equipment and the infrastructure. Mining concluded on June 30, 1973 at Cornwall, when the last ore was hauled out of the open pit and delivered to the concentrator plant. Another way to look at it is how much did each mine contribute? As you see in this pie chart, slightly over half of the ore produced, 56%, came from the Big Hill and the open pit. The number 4 mine produced about 32% of the ore, and then the number 3 mine produced about 12% of the ore. In addition, of course, to the ore represented on this chart, we also have the ore generated in the Robesonia cut and the ore that came from the Elizabeth mine to the east of Big Hill. Now, in addition to the ore, the iron ore that was produced, the Cornwall Mines and the concentrator plants also produced copper, cobalt, silver, and gold, as I earlier mentioned. And their production rates are depicted in this set of graphs. Starting in the bottom graph, cobalt production is shown in purple, copper in green, and then in the upper graph, gold is shown by the orange line and the silver as the blue line. I want to highlight that the scales of the two graphs are entirely different. So the top chart is a vertical scales in troy ounces, whereas in the bottom chart, the vertical axis is in ton units. So even though it may not look this way, the amounts of copper and cobalt that were produced here at Cornwall vastly exceeded the amounts of gold and silver that were produced. Those production rates varied based on a variety of factors, but the overall controlling factor was the amount of iron ore that was mined in any given year. Even as the miners and millers learned how to better extract those metals, they were able to maintain those high production rates even as the ore concentrations were getting weaker and weaker. So total production of those metals in the 20th century included 162,000 tons of copper, 8,400 tons of cobalt, 430,000 troy ounces of silver, and then 62,000 troy ounces of gold. That's a lot of metals. Now, turning to the local industry that was spawned by the Cornwall mines, the rich and abundant iron ore at Cornwall helped to seed the iron and steel industry of both Lebanon County and central Pennsylvania. Iron served as the backbone of the Lebanon County economy, along with agriculture, after the Revolutionary War. The Cornwall mines provided abundant ore for new furnaces, forges, foundries, and mills. And as you can see in this map, the mine supplied ore to more than 20 furnaces in and around Cornwall and throughout central Pennsylvania before 1858. Cornwall is shown as the red star in the map, and then each of those yellow dots represents one or more iron blast furnaces that received ore and used the ore from Cornwall in making iron. Cornwall Furnace, supplied by iron ore from the mines, closed in 1883. And today, the furnace fulfills the vision of Margaret Coleman Freeman Buckingham by serving as a museum of iron furnace technology. And as Mike earlier alluded to, that's under the auspices of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Cornwall Furnace has been recognized as a registered National Historic Landmark by the National Park Service, a National Historic Landmark by the American Society for Metals, and a National Historic Mechanical Engineering Landmark by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. By the time that Cornwall Furnace closed in 1883, hot blast furnaces became dominant throughout Pennsylvania. So the Cornwall Mines satisfied the iron ore demands of those furnaces, both in Cornwall as well as nearby in Lebanon and Robesonia. Following the arrival of Bethlehem Steel in 1916 and the consolidation of the iron and steel industry, Cornwall ore supplied a handful of furnaces that were located at greater distances from the mines. And they included Bethlehem, Lackawanna, Sparrows Point, Steelton, High Spire, and Johnstown. Of course, as the iron and steel industry grew, so too did the total number of employees, as well as the supporting and related industries. The mines of Cornwall helped to establish the transportation systems of central Pennsylvania, including the roads, the turnpikes, canals, and the railroads, along with furnaces, forges, grist and sawmills, blacksmiths, and a variety of other manufacturers. Without the mines, the manufacturing might of Pennsylvania would not be what it is today. Weimer Machine Works, Lebanon Manufacturing Company, Lebanon Stove Works, Van de Sand and Kopp's Rolling and Puddling Mills, Lebanon Boiler and Machine Works, Pennsylvania Bolt and Nut Works, Pennsylvania Steel, Bethlehem Steel were all attracted to the Lebanon area by the ore at Cornwall. Corn at Orwell, or at Cornwall. Besides the iron and steel factories, Lebanon operated tanneries and shoe factories, carriage factories, cigar manufacturers, paper box manufacturing, the Eagle Planing Mill, the Miller Brothers Lumber, and abundant limestone quarries. These early industries paved the way for government installations, including Fort Indian Town Gap and the Veterans Affairs Hospital, textile manufacturing, pharmaceutical and chemical manufacturing, healthcare and research, and the food industries, including Bell and Evans, ASK Foods, and Murray's. And let us not forget the production of that world-famous Lebanon bologna by the Weaver, Seltzer, Baumberger, and Brooks families. Today, Lebanon County offers a strategic location, strong transportation networks, a high quality of life, and a skilled and a trained workforce. In addition to spawning, supporting, and related industries, the mines supported the growing communities around Cornwall and Lebanon. The villages of Cornwall consolidated into Cornwall Borough in 1926 with the encouragement and backing of Bethlehem Steel. And then later in the 1950s, Bethlehem Steel sold homes that were previously rented to the miners and their families across the borough, which helped to build a strong foundation for the Cornwall community after the close of the mines. And along with the homes, Bethlehem Steel provided other community services over the years, including trash collections, drinking water supply, property maintenance, road construction, security, and education support. The company constructed schools and churches and maintained them over many decades. Bethlehem Steel conducted outreach and supported civic and educational organizations, hosted open houses like this one that attracted more than 1,000 people in 1964 at the new Concentrator Plant. Cornwall employees conducted blood drives and taught first aid and artificial resuscitation to students, Boys and Girl Scouts, and YM and YWCA groups. In short, the miners, millers, and the companies that operated the mines and nearby furnaces laid the foundation for the communities represented today by Cornwall, Lebanon, and the surrounding towns. The miners and millers of Cornwall played an essential role in developing the workforce and harvesting the riches of the earth. Without them, there would not have been a legacy of mining and milling at Cornwall for over 200 years. This graph depicts the total number of employees at the Cornwall division of Bethlehem Steel from 1879 until the mines closed. By extrapolating back in time from when Bethlehem Steel took over operations in 1916, I estimated the approximate number of employees at the Cornwall Ore Bank Company and the Lebanon Concentrator, roughly the equivalent of the Cornwall division from 1916 until 73. The number of employees dropped significantly during the Great Depression, even though Bethlehem Steel worked hard to keep the greatest number of employees working and to pay them enough to keep food on their tables. The number of employees peaked in the 52 to 53 timeframe with just under 1,200 workers in the division. These employees were critically important in boosting production in the number 3 and the number 4 mines, ramping down mining in the open pit, and fine-tuning operations of the concentrator plant, including the construction and operation of those pellet furnaces. Over the lifetime of the mines, an estimated 10,000 workers were directly employed in mining and milling at Cornwall. Now, when mining began at Cornwall, a handful of miners extracted the ore using hand tools and supplied enough ore to the local furnaces to keep them in operation or in blast. As mining increased and production rates grew in the early 19th century, so too did the number of miners, as we see in this photo of the miners at Big Hill in the 1880s. Ore was transported out of the mines using wheelbarrows, mule dump carts, and horse-drawn wagons. Cornwall Ore Bank Company began building good houses for the miners and their families in Miners Village to accommodate the miners. As hot blast furnaces later came to Cornwall, the furnace operators emulated these accommodations for the miners by building additional houses for the furnace workers at Anthracite, Goosetown, Bird Coleman, and North Cornwall. When these furnaces were no longer needed, Bethlehem Steel took over the company houses and provided them to a growing number of miners and their families. Other villages were added over the years, including Rexmont, Toytown, and Carringeville. As ore production rates increased, miners used improved technologies to transport the ore using railroads, skip hoists, trucks, and conveyors. Other technologies were used by the miners to drill and excavate the ore and the waste rock, including steam and pneumatic drills, steam and electric shovels, and gasoline and diesel-powered excavators. Rock crushers and screens were added beginning in 1904 to reduce the size of the ore and prepare it for use in the concentrator and the furnaces. And as the mines grew, so too did the number and diversity of miners and millers and the skills that were required to operate the mines and the mills. Although technological enhancements were used to boost production, the mines of Cornwall would not have existed without the miners and millers. They devoted themselves to winning the riches of the earth at Cornwall and providing for their families and the communities. They dedicated their blood, sweat, and toil, their vigilance, drive, and ingenuity, cooperation, respect, humor, strength, and even occasionally their lives to the production of ore and metal. We owe them a debt of gratitude for their sacrifices and the sacrifices of their families. Let us remember men like Victor Alcala, Duke Angelo, Tink Beard, Dewey Bernard, Cal Bixler, Brick Bowder, Starkey Carpenter, Richard Chernich, Al Ditzler, Bugs Engel, Pancho Fiorentino, Pepper Hostetter, Buck Jones, Steve Carriage, Koppy Koppenhaver, Mel Lipinski, Boz Lozer, Joe Metley, Charlie Neal, Saul Ream, Elsa Rossini, Tony Souders, Hode Redinger, Big Schmitty, Pop Showers, Shoes Tanini, Tom Vasili, Dutch Worth, Junie Whitman, Wimp Winter, Shorty Yingst, and so many other miners, too numerous to name. We thank them for their service and dedication in making Cornwall what it is today. As we've seen in our presentation tonight, the mines of Cornwall produced 106 million tons of iron ore over 236 years, from 1737 until 1973. And in addition to iron, they also produced copper, silver, gold, and cobalt. The mines at Cornwall were the largest iron ore mines in the United States until the 1880s, and one of the longest continuously operated mines in the Western Hemisphere. The riches won at Cornwall helped to establish the region and support the nation's growth and prosperity. As we reflect together on the end of an era of mining at Cornwall, I hope that you have a better appreciation of the accomplishments and the sacrifices of the miners and millers and their families at Cornwall. I want to thank you for your attention throughout tonight's presentation. And I'd also like to thank the people who shared photos over the years, both for this presentation and earlier ones, including Jay Angelo, Mike Trump, Mike Bernard, Daniel Chernich, the Lebanon County Historical Society, and of course, the Cornwall Iron Furnace. I look forward to seeing you at the 50th commemoration of the closure of the Cornwall Mines at Cornwall Elementary School and Cornwall Furnace this Saturday at 10 o'clock, June 17th. And of course, I'd like to thank Cornwall Manor for hosting our presentation tonight, to the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates for sponsoring the webinar, and especially Mike Emery, Cornwall Site Administrator, Kathy Donaldson, the Treasurer of the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates, and Bruce Chadbourne, our videographer, researcher, and Cornwall Manor resident. And now, after Mike talks, I'd be happy to answer your questions and listen to your comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. That was a great talk. I think one of the points that I really loved in that was just when you look at what the effect of the iron industry was in Pennsylvania, what it touched and everything else it touched it, but also this locality. If the mine was not here, how different would this landscape look? How different would the makeup of the people be? That's one of the things that when we look at the people that came here to Cornwall, we have our traditional Pennsylvania Dutch. We had, African slaves that were brought here in the 18th century, indentured servants from the Palatinate in Germany, from Ireland, from Great Britain, and then moving on to the late 19th century, you had Italians that were being directly brought over from Italy, being recruited to go work in the iron industry here and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's where we have all the Hungarian names that are here. So if it wasn't for this industry, so many of the people that are in this community would not be in the room. It just wouldn't be here. So it's amazing what, and I almost shudder to say this in front of Mike, what a big pile of rocks did for this community and for this area and also for the Commonwealth. So it's kind of amazing and really does show the interconnectedness. And that's really the great thing about history is that we look for, you compare, contrast, you see the connections, and that was a really great way of putting it. So we'll move on to the question and answer section of the talk. I do have a few questions online. I'll start there, and after Mike answers a question or two there, if you think of things, he'll call on you. The other thing is that we typically have Mike go ahead and repeat that question, because otherwise the folks at home are only hearing half of a conversation. So when you give your question, Mike's probably going to go ahead and restate that so the people at home can hear the question as well as the answer. So we'll move on there. I'll turn this back over to Mike.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, what questions do we have?
Our first question that we have has to do with the water in the mine.
Okay, so our first question is, how did Miners Lake fill up in the open pit? A lot of the water in the open pit today is groundwater that flowed in from the rocks adjacent to the open pit. When you dig a hole that's 450 feet deep in this part of the country, it's going to fill up with water pretty fast. And then on top of that, you also had Furnace Creek that flowed into the southeast corner of the open pit. And every time it rains, you have surface water runoff that flows into the pit. Now, the pit maximum level is controlled by an outlet that's close to the machine shop that was originally constructed for the operation of the open pit. And so it will only get as high as it currently is. Don't look for a large scale flood from the open pit unless something were to happen to that outlet. So hopefully they're maintaining that and ensuring that the Furnace Creek continues to flow.
Okay. Another question, what you had mentioned about the impoundments. What are
the question is, what are the risks to groundwater beneath the tailings impoundments, both in Lebanon and Cornwall? Simply stated, the groundwater is probably contaminated with chemicals that will come out of the tailings. That doesn't mean it's an imminent threat to anyone, but certainly I'm sure local authorities in Bethlehem Steel, when they operated the mines, would monitor that water quality to ensure that they weren't causing problems. Once the tailings are covered, then to a large degree evapotranspiration takes over. So you're going to be drawing water out of those tailings with the plants that are growing on top of it, and some of the water is going to evaporate off the surface of the water body. But my guess is you probably have elevated levels of certain chemicals in the groundwater underneath those impoundments. I don't have any firsthand knowledge of that because I haven't actually sampled the groundwater. And I'm not aware of any studies that have sampled the groundwater. I do know from the records that I've reviewed that Bethlehem Steel was focused on the potential impacts of those tailings impoundments on the local environment because they actively talked about it, about ensuring that the tailings remain stable and don't cause environmental problems. And that was pretty progressive at the time because remember, mining ended in 1973 and many of our environmental statutes at the federal level did not get enacted into law until the 1970s.
Another question is about company housing. And the question is how long did
so the question is about company housing provided by Bethlehem Steel. It's a complicated answer because there were certain senior managers who continued to have company housing provided by Bethlehem Steel, I believe up until the time that the mines closed, and maybe even a little bit longer. For example, Charlie Neal, I know, lived in a property, but by that time he may have actually purchased his property, so scratch that. But Bethlehem Steel started selling the houses to the people that lived in those homes in 1957. And a large number of the homes, I think it was about 190 or so of the homes that had been rented to the miners were purchased by the families who were residing in those homes back then in the 1957, 1958 timeframe.
and that would include like Bird Coleman.
Yeah. So Mike's encouraging me to point out that would include homes in Bird Coleman, Miners Village, Anthracite, and a variety of houses that aren't really even in designated villages, but were used as rental properties for the miners and their families, including widows and descendants of the miners.
Another question, are any of the areas around the number 3 and number 4 mines a concentrator?
So the question is, are any of the areas around the number 3 or number 4 mine and the concentrator accessible to members of the public? And the answer is no, they're all on private property, unless you make arrangements with the people who own that property. And if it's okay with them, then, you know, you can work those arrangements out with them. That's it for questions online. How about questions here? Yes, miss. It's my sister.
You keep saying miners and millers. What's a miller?
Okay. So the question is, I referred to miners and millers. What's a miller? In this context, the context of my presentation, I'm referring to the men who worked in the concentrator plant as millers. Remember, the front end, the head end of the concentrator plant is crushing the ore even finer into a fine powder before it was then used magnetic separators to concentrate the iron, or the flotation plant produced the copper and the pyrite concentrates. Those all fall under the general term of miller, because you're milling the ore, you're grinding it fine, just like a grist mill would take grain and grind the grist, the grain finer. Those people would also be called millers, but in this case, they were milling ore and not grain. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes, sir.
Where is the miner statue?
The miner statue is on the grounds of Cornwall Elementary School. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have repeated the question. So the question is, where is the miner statue, which you see on this photograph? So the miner statue is on the grounds of the Cornwall Elementary School. It's we will be there on Saturday morning. We're going to have a wreath laying at the foot of the miner's statue in honor and tribute to the miners and the millers. So it's on, is that Cornwall Road there?
It's the intersection of all.
Yeah, I'm getting lots of hand signals in the room, but just look up Cornwall Elementary School and you'll find the miner statue.
Go to the top up here, you go all the way to the bottom of the hill, swing down, it's right over here on the left-hand side.
Thanks.
The address of the school is actually Bird Coleman.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Oh, Bird Coleman.
Is the address of the school, but it's the other side.
Oh, okay.
It's across from the police station.
Oh, it's across from the Cornwall Police Station. That's a good clue. Yeah. And it's close to a 5-way intersection through which Route 419 travels, and Cornwall Road goes off in one direction and Bird Coleman Road goes off in another direction. But if you look up Cornwall Elementary School or Cornwall Police Station, you'll be very close to the miner statue. Thanks. Other questions? Sir.
It seems to me in your charts that production and employees went up in the days prior to World War II, but it looked like iron and steel during the war. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so the question is, looking at the charts, both the employment charts and the ore production charts, the gentleman was surprised to see that ore production rates actually declined during World War II. Can I explain that? Those years were the peak years of production for Cornwall Mines. But you are correct, over the span of the war effort, the total production did decrease, even though there remained a heavy demand for iron in the United States. The reason that happened is a large number of the miners were enlisted or drafted into the military services. So I think by the end of the war, over 200 miners who had been assigned to the number 4 mine had enlisted or had been drafted into the military services. because they had therefore fewer miners to operate the mines, they could not develop the mines as much. They really focused on production. Any mining operation requires both the production of the ore and the development of the mine. And you can't have production without development. So because they prioritize production over development, when those parts of the mine yielded the ore that they had available and they were ready to move on to the other parts of the mine, those other parts of the mine were not as developed, not as ready to produce large amounts of ore. And that's why you see the reduction in ore production rates during the World War II period.
Could the miners have been exempt from the draft because of the need for ore production?
Yeah, so the question is, could the miners have been exempted from the draft because of the need for war production? The answer is yes, they could have been, but that's not what the law established. And the miners, not just here at Cornwall, but across the United States, represents a fairly large section of the working population at that time. And so that would have put constraints on the availability of men and women to serve in the military services. So legislation has consequences. Yes, Brian.
Statute, when was it in place and how was it financed?
I don't know. The question was the statute, when was it in place and how was it financed? I know it was in place by 1983, but I don't know. Maybe somebody in the room knows. Anybody know? We need Ann Lipinski. Do you know, Brian?
I don't.
No. It's a beautiful statue. It's a great rendition, has all the right safety gear on, but I don't know. I'll have to do more research. Okay, other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm not sure how to word this, but I'll give it a shot. So the real modern age is when Bethlehem, is it fair to say the modern age really is when Bethlehem takes over?
So the gentleman's question is the modern age when Bethlehem Steel takes over the mining operation? I would look at it more as an evolution. Even the families that were operating the mines before the Cornwall Ore Bank Company was established were using innovative technologies and techniques to mine the ore. Cornwall Ore Bank Company raised that extensively because they could pool together the resources of the company. And then when Bethlehem Steel came, yes, they weren't just mining here at Cornwall, but they were mining throughout the United States and abroad. And they were sharing mining technology so they could leverage other activities. One example of that is by the early 1960s in the number 4 mine, they started doing what were called checkerboard concrete drifts in the underground mine. And that technique was earlier developed at the Climax molybdenum mine in Climax, Colorado. So that's an example where, as far as I know, Bethlehem Steel had no involvement in the Climax molybdenum mine, but they were able to learn through the literature and then take that technology and apply it. Another example of that are the iron pellets that Bethlehem Steel started producing at the Lebanon Concentrator Plant in 1950. They were leveraging technology which had really been developed in the Great Lakes or with the taconite mining, but they developed it with their own techniques and actually got it up and running and used it productively for the next 20 years. So
The answer is that the statue was installed and dedicated Sunday, December 5th, 1990.
Oh, so Mike just said somebody online shared with us that the miners statue at Cornwall was installed and dedicated 1993. What was the month and date?
December 5th.
December 5th, 1993.
It says the accompanying the statue is a large 7,230 pound piece of magnetite ore donated by Super.
So if you've been to the statue, the miner statue, you know that there's also an adjacent large chunk of ore that was dedicated or donated by Superintendent of Mines at Cornwall, Mel Lipinski. All right, thanks. So was it privately?
It said the $27,000 cost was sustained by contributions of former mine workers and their families, businesses in Cornwall and the Lebanon area.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to repeat. So Mike is sharing. Are you Googling this as we're talking?
There's actually an article about that.
Oh, an article about it. So the funds to acquire the statue came from miners and their families, came from Bethlehem Steel, businesses in the Cornwall area, and also state allocated funds that were arranged for by Senator David Brightbill and Representative Peter Zug. Zug in German, right? Zug in Pennsylvania, I guess. All right, thanks. Yes, sir, you had a question or a comment?
Many years ago, my friends and I would search along the railroad for little pellets, which were great slingshot ants. Would I be correct assuming that was the pellets that were made of the concentrator?
Yeah, so the question / comment was years ago, the gentleman collected iron balls that he found along the railroad tracks and used them as slingshot ammunition. And would he be correct in saying that those are the iron pellets? And yes, he would be correct in saying that those are the iron pellets. Pellets ranged from about maybe 3/8 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch. They weren't always perfectly rounded. What Bethlehem Steel did here at Cornwall and also in Lebanon is they would take the finely crushed iron and mix it with bentonite clay, and then they would tumble it in a large tank, which would roll the little pellets, and then feed those pellets into a furnace where they would bake them, and that's how they produced those iron pellets. And they are very good slingshot ammunition. I collected them myself at an earlier age. Yes, sir.
Kind of a big picture question. If Bethlehem Steel had put money into research and modernization,
Yeah.
the nature of the business.
Right. So the gentleman's asking from a big picture perspective, if certain investments had been made on research and development and upgrading technology, could the mine have continued to operate beyond when it did? And the answer is probably not. And the reason I say that, and I took a lot of effort to focus on this in the book, is that even from the 1940s, Bethlehem Steel as a company was doing its due diligence and was making forecasts on how much longer are we going to be able to mine iron ore here at Cornwall. And in the late 50s, they got to the point where they were forecasting that the ore would run out at the current rates of production in about between 1973 and 1975. And then in the 60s, they sharpened that forecast because they were getting closer to the end point. And they forecast that the mine would shut down in about 1972. And so, in fact, by the time the number 3 mine and the number 4 mine closed in June of 1972 as a result of Tropical Storm Agnes, the number 4 mine had already been overdrawn by about 300,000 tons of ore. Now, when I use that figure overdrawn, all that means is they got more out of the mine than they originally expected to. So when you start a mining operation, you make some grand forecast. We're going to recover this much material. And then as you operate the mine, you continue to refine that estimate, and because you don't want to be surprised by that event. The number 3 mine still had about 70,000 tons of ore or so when it shut down. I would estimate, based on the research that Bethlehem Steel did and also research done by the Pennsylvania State Geological Survey, that there's probably several million tons of magnetite ore that remain here at Cornwall that wasn't mined. And people might say, wow, let's go for it. But that would require quite an investment of time and effort and money, and a lot of cooperation from people in this area. And it probably would not be worthwhile to go after that remnant of the ore deposit. Okay. So in my view, it has nothing to do with their diligence or their lack of research. I think they controlled their operations well and operated them for the most part safely. And the mine closed. If it hadn't been the underground mines in 72 and the surface mine in 73, maybe it would have been in 73, 74, but not much different. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
The constant closing right now.
1962. Yeah. February of 1962. Now, they still had a couple. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have repeated the question. The question was, when did the concentrator plant close in Lebanon? And the answer was February 1962. They still had a couple hundred employees beyond February because they were cleaning up and preparing the land to sell. They did sell some of that land to an adjacent user, but then most of the mill buildings, the concentrator buildings, were torn down. I was looking at a satellite photo today, and the landscape is far different than it looked back when the. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, Mike.
So, question from online, going back to the iron pellets. It says, were the iron pellets called taconite?
So the question from online, were the iron pellets called taconite? And the answer is no. Now, I mentioned that technology for developing the iron pellets was prompted by the work that was being done in the Mesabi Range and in the Great Lakes Ore District to develop the process to recover iron ore from taconite. So that's how the taconite label got assigned to those iron pellets. But I did not see any reference to taconite in the monthly reports that that Bethlehem Steel were sending back to the mothership in Bethlehem. They called them iron pellets. Other questions, comments? Yes.
Your opening shot, your title slide.
Yeah.
Is that number 4 mine?
That is number 4 mine. So his question is, the opening shot in the title slide, is that the number 4 mine? And yes, that's the number 4 mine. You're looking upward towards, I think, one of the head frames, the head frame for the number 4 shaft, as well as the hopper that was over top of the secondary ore crusher at the number 4 mine as part of the surface plant. And then you see a locomotive streaming by on the railroad line that was at the base of that hill. Good observation. All right, I'll turn it over to Mike. See you on Saturday.
All right. Again, thank you, Mike. Just one other comment that I wanted to make, why do we do things like this? Why do we have this? Of course, history, sometimes we say it's important. Well, why is it important? And I don't want to brag or anything, but I'll just say this. When this mine closed, I was 6 months old. I have children, I actually have classmates of mine who are grandparents. So people my age and one or two generations below that never knew this mine operating. And that's one of the really big things is that another thing, I was at a meeting this evening and a fact was brought up that said that Lebanon County right now is the second in the growth of the county percentage-wise behind Cumberland County. So that means when people are going out, that means there's a lot of people moving into the area. So we have that 50 years. So we have a couple of generations plus. We have lots of people moving in from outside the area. So it is very important that we let people know what was here before that. Why is this here? Again, why are these groups living here? Why are things named this? Why is this road here? Why is there a rail trail here? So these are very important things to do. So again, I thank you all for coming out. So I would also thank you for joining us for this lecture. I especially want to thank Mike Weber for his presentation, Kathy Donaldson and Bruce Chadbourne for helping to organize our virtual talk. Also want to thank the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace who sponsored this program and Cornwall Manor for allowing us to use this wonderful space. So please join us for our next lecture, which will be Tuesday, August 8th, when Jim Polzinski, who's the president of the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates, will speak about the Pullmans and Mardick Forge, which was in Lancaster County. And of course, as Mike already said, this Saturday, June 17th at 10 a.m., the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates will also hold a remembrance ceremony at Cornwall Elementary School to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the closure of the mines, and all are invited to attend. I know we have invited a number of surviving miners. We have about a dozen and a half who've RSVP'd that are coming. Our youngest miners, again, this is 50 years ago, are right around 70, and most of them were college students who did this, as a good college job. But we also, our oldest miner, we have two that are coming in their 90s. The oldest is 98 years old, went off to World War II. So he's a veteran of World War II, came back in 1946, got a job in the mines, and was there until 1973 when it closed, worked for PennDOT for 13 years after that. He's been retired since 1986. He's one, Frank Stellar, this is the gentleman, is one of the people that we had interviewed, sharp as a tack, and can probably outrun half of us in this room. And if you challenge him to it, he'll do it. He'll absolutely do it. So if you do have the time and an inclination, we'll have a number of elected officials that will speak. Mike is going to speak during the wreath laying. Also, Bruce Chadbourne is going to offer some words. So, if you have that inclination, please come out and support not really the museum, support the local community. These are going to be, I think, a lot of people that have, family connections, obviously, and just an interest in the history. So we're really looking forward to having a good crowd come out that day. Also, just a reminder that the museum is open Friday through Sunday for tours. That also means we're open Friday through Sunday to sell books. So if you're interested in Mike Weber's new book, Always More Production, that'll be available for sale at the museum store, but also will be available on June 17th. Also, Kathy Donaldson, aside from being treasurer, is also one of the managers of our museum store. She has all kinds of great Bethlehem Steel merchandise, hats and shirts and things. So, if you know someone that would like that, we'll have that as well. Thank you very much for the illustration in the back of the room. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night. We do have a basket in the back of the room. If you are so inclined, that would help to financially support this presentation like this, that we're able to still do this with Zoom. So if you do have a few extra dollars you'd like to throw our way, we greatly appreciate it. But thank you very much for coming out and have a good night.